Well, hello, everyone. We will give people a minute or two to get on board, and then we will begin. It's a good message to everyone to turn your ringers off. All right, well, welcome everyone to Election Cybersecurity from a legislative perspective. It actually warms me quite a bit to know that so many of you are joining us today. The topic is critical to our democracy, but with the next general election 20 months away, and with so many other competing legislative priorities, many people may be thinking election cybersecurity is on the, I'll think about that later list. So for you all, you are keeping it top of mind, and I really appreciate that. So let's start with, is there a problem? I have that answer from a report released just 2 days ago. This was a report from the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security. And their top line was this: no evidence found that a foreign government manipulated any election results, referencing the 2020 election. But that sounds great. And then it goes on to say that Russia, Chinese, and Iranian government-affiliated actors, quote, materially impacted the security of certain networks, end quote, during the 2020 election. So I'm glad that there was no manipulation of election results, but I am puzzled by those material impacts that were had. And we will learn more about that during our next hour, plus much more. But let's start with introductions. I'm Wendy Underhill. I'm the director of NCSL's election and redistricting team. And I want to emphasize that word team. Behind the scenes, we have Brian Hinkle, we have Mandy Zock, Ben Williams, and Christy Zamarippa. And those are the folks that really make the magic happen for us on elections and redistricting. And our goal at NCSL is to serve legislators and legislative staff throughout the nation. And we do that primarily by answering questions. So if you have questions that we might be able to answer, by all means, let us know. And if we don't know the answers, we may easily know where to find the experts who do. And of course, that's what we've done today. We're not experts on cybersecurity, but we knew how to find a couple of them. So I want to introduce Adam Clayton Powell III. He's with us. You probably recognize his name because he's been a journalist for some 50 years, and he's worked at CBS and NPR and the Newseum, just to name 3 of his former affiliations. But for our purposes, what really matters is that he's the director of the University of Southern California's Initiative on Election Cybersecurity, which provides training in all 50 states to reinforce election integrity and to build defense against digital attacks. Welcome, Adam.
Thank you for inviting us.
Oh, glad to have you. We also have Clifford Newman with us today. He's a scientist at the Information Sciences Institute at USC, and he also holds a research faculty appointment in the computer science department, which of course makes me wonder how you have 2 jobs, but that's okay. I learned from looking at his bio that his research focuses on issues of scale in large distribution systems. That's issues of scale in large distribution systems. And I'm fairly sure that US elections fit that category of large and distributed. Cliff, thanks for taking time to be with us today.
Thank you. And by the way, ISI is part of USC. So it's not 2 jobs, it's just different things.
Thank you, thank you. When I read your bio, and then I knew you were also key on this election cybersecurity part, I'm like, whoa, this is a man who never sleeps. All right, so bios for both Adam and Cliff will be in the chat box for you. So let's just go ahead and get started here. Adam, tell us how it is that a journalist ended up at the University of Southern California and involved with election cybersecurity. What is this program that you are directing?
Well, my appointments at USC were both I retired in 2010, so this is my post-retirement job. My appointments at USC were both in the Viterbi School of Engineering and in the Annenberg School of Communication. And so my research and my teaching is at the intersection of technology and content. How we got involved in cybersecurity is that after I retired and moved to the USC Washington, D.C. office, we used to have a quarterly series of planning meetings to try to update cell phone regulations, to try to work with agencies to modernize regulations and other things that might have been out of date. And in one of those meetings 6 years ago, Vince Cerf, who was the co-inventor of the internet back in the 1960s, he said, why aren't we talking about securing everything on the internet? You can buy a coffee maker now with an IP address. I mean, LG wants to sell you a refrigerator connected to the internet. We need to secure everything on the internet. And everybody around the table nodded, said, okay, from now on, it's the Internet of Things and securing the internet. Well, our partner that came in right after that, the National Governors Association, they decided to make USC their research partner on cybersecurity. And of course, after the 2016 election, the security of elections really bubbled up to the top as #1 priority. So we did programs with the NGA, including off-the-record programs for state governments at state capitals. And then last year in 2020, we did 50 states, programs for each of the 50 states, most of them virtual because of the pandemic, but we reached almost 4,000 people, state and campaign election workers and others, with workshops that are independent, nonpartisan, and vendor and platform agnostic. We'll be back again this year in 2021, starting next Thursday, March 25th, with the first of a series of workshops again for the 50 states.
Well, that's great. It sounds as though what people who are attending today can get is a sense of what USC has to offer on this topic, and that there's ways for them to dig in deeper with you as things progress. So you've mentioned 2016, and now we've been through the 2020 election. Cliff, can you tell us how the 2020 election was different in terms of cybersecurity from previous elections?
Sure, really. The biggest difference in terms of cybersecurity for the 2020 election was really awareness of the problem and a concerted focus by agencies like CISA and the EAC in supporting state governments and the secretaries of state in protecting their elections infrastructure. Really, to a large extent, those running the elections, because of this education, understood the need for, well, one, a paper trail, what we call a durable record of intent, and also really strict isolation of the systems that are used for tabulating the votes. And the end result was that when outcomes were questioned, and yes, the outcomes were questioned, the officials in charge were able to speak with greater confidence that the results were correct and that there was the ability to do the manual recounts in those instances where there actually was a concern. Now, it's also important to understand that our adversaries are also more capable today. We do more and more online, not just casting of votes. And that makes us as individuals more vulnerable. We also learned, unrelated to the election, about the SolarWinds breach, which highlighted the cyber capabilities of the Russians and other adversaries. And I think it was actually the strict isolation of the election tabulating systems from other government functions, one of the things that was put in place here, that really prevented the SolarWinds breach from affecting the elections. Now, that's not to say that there weren't incidents surrounding the elections, but these were kept away from the methods used to tabulate votes, instead affecting things like campaigns or voter registration systems, not counting, but maybe the registration systems. And there was also significant cyber activity around disinformation campaigns. But again, strong isolation and awareness training and that paper trail were in place to protect the actual counting of the votes.
Okay, so it sounds like 2016 was a heads up. 2017 and on, we had the federal government come in with DHS and CISA. Can you tell us what CISA stands for? I know what it is, but I can't give you its what it means. Cybersecurity infrastructure. Okay, we'll get it in the chat box so we get that straight. So a lot of attention was paid, and you've made the point that the actual equipment that counts the votes is separated from the internet. Is that something we can say across the board in every state that there's no connection? Oh, I just asked a tough question, didn't I? I'm sorry.
Well, no, I mean, it's something that we can't say occurs everywhere, but that level of isolation is stronger than just having, the normal government employees and, I mean, Think of how often we've heard about breaches at the DMV and things like that. There is stronger isolation. It's not necessarily what we would call an air gap, but you're not using the same systems that you're using for the day-to-day operations.
Got it. Got it. Now, I forgot to say to everyone who's out in the audience that you all are welcome to join in the conversation. You can put your questions in the chat box, or if you'd like to be unmuted and ask your question out loud, that's fine too. If you can find the hand to raise your hand, please do. So Cliff, the other thing about the 2020 was that there was a pandemic. I'm sure you remember that. How did that change the cybersecurity threats to elections, if it did in any way?
Well, it changed the cybersecurity threats to a lot of organizations because you have more and more employees that are working from home. Now, because of the strict isolation that we've got with the vote counting, no, we weren't sending the employees that were going to count votes to do it at home. Okay, we didn't do that. You did end up with more and more voters voting by mail, for example, but that didn't have a strict cybersecurity element to it. It did affect some other issues around the election. But generally, because we are working more and more from home, if you give your employees access to sensitive data from their home locations, you no longer have the level of physical security around where they're accessing that data, and that does create some cybersecurity issues.
And I'm working at home for NCSL, and I bet many of the people in the audience are also working from home. We've just been asked to shift over to multi-factor authentication to turn on our equipment, and I'll tell you all how naive I was. I said, well, I don't really need to do that because I'm just in my house and I never go anywhere. I can't lose my computer. And no, that was not the right answer. The right answer is you need it even if you're at the house, possibly more so than when you're at the office.
Right. Well, the multi-factor authentication you use to thwart some kinds of threats, and I think we're going to talk a little bit about those a bit later. There are other steps that you would take specifically when you're at home. And that gets in line with sort of physical takeover of locations. It's much easier for someone to come in and break into your house than it is to, let's say, state capitol, for example, although we did see the breach in our nation's capital, which did affect the physical security of some of the devices that were in conference rooms, even the speaker's desktop.
Okay, so we've got some more stuff coming up on that, but Adam, I want to come back to you for just a moment. And can you talk to us a little bit about who are the people who are trying to make cybersecurity attacks on our elections? What motivates these people?
Well, the people are mainly, as you said at the beginning, coming from Russia, China, Iran, to some extent North Korea. Actually, David Sanger, who covers intelligence for the New York Times, told me that there are more than 30 countries, more than 30 countries that are hacking into the United States, trying to peer into how our systems are working, including election systems. But the big player by far is Russia. And they have the R&D budget to try to crack into our secure systems. They have the people and the budget, the resources to really attack American systems, and they keep inventing. We saw over the course of 2020 new and different techniques that Russia was using. And interestingly, Russia turned out to be almost like the R&D center for all the bad actors, because if Russia did something, then China and Iran might copy them a week or two later. So that's the major threat is Russia, and they have a building full of people in St. Petersburg, Russia, working on this.
Oh my goodness! So what you told us is that threats are viral and spreading around the nation. I don't know if we want to go so far as to say there's a pandemic of it, but when you get to 30 nation states, then maybe so. What about domestic threats? Should we be thinking about other kinds of threats as well?
Well, everyone is across the country, and certainly in state capitals, are aware of ransomware attacks. And those are coming from organized crime. They're coming from sometimes just individual criminals. And the difference between what the foreign actors are doing and the domestic actors are doing. The domestic actors tend to be in it for the money. The foreign actors are trying to discredit our election system, trying to discredit democracy itself. But they're using some of the same techniques to try to steal passwords, to try to get through lightly guarded systems, and going after, as we know, sometimes a small school district or a hospital. And so it's cybersecurity is something which is it's just something where you just can never sleep. It just is all around you.
I got it. They're trying to, they've got thousands of attacks coming and you have to defend against all of them, it sounds like. So the defensive position is pretty tough. Cliff, let's talk a little bit more about some of the things that have already surfaced. We had the word ransomware come up already. Tell us what that is, and can you put like an example around it so we can really understand that? You've got people at all different levels here. So what is a ransomware attack and how does it work? And then we'll go on to a couple more.
Right. So thinking about ransomware, and actually I'd like to broaden the term a little bit to sort of malware or malicious software that takes over your system. And the term that we use sort of technically is subversion. It subverts your system. Now, if you install malware by clicking on a bad link to an attack site, for example, or by installing apps or applications that you really shouldn't, you're getting them from an untrusted source or something, this software can then disable your system. And that's sort of what we see in the terms of ransomware. In other words, it disables your system and then it pops up a demand for a ransom. You need to send so much in Bitcoin to some overseas location, for example, in order to get the information needed to re-enable your system. But it can do a lot of other things than just disable your system. When we broaden it to the area of things like malware and viruses and worms and Trojan horses. It can steal data from your system. Or in the worst case, it could even potentially modify a system to do things like, well, for example, change votes. That's why the paper trail is so important to things we do. And there are many additional steps that can be taken to really lock down, that is, protect the integrity of critical systems. And believe me, these steps are being taken, not universally, but in many of the systems that are out there, they are. And that makes it more difficult for such malware to actually take hold. But that's the kind of thing that could conceivably happen from malware. And ransomware and malware are forms of subversion. Now, there's another form of subversion we've heard a lot about in the news recently. This is what we call supply chain subversion. That's when this malicious code is inserted in the manufacturing or distribution process of software. And the SolarWinds breach that we've heard about, sort of separate from the election, is an example of this kind of supply chain subversion. And by the way, we did hear in the aftermath of the election, the refuted accusations from the Trump campaign of this kind of supply chain subversion in the Dominion voting software. Now, this was refuted, but that is precisely an example of the kind of subversion that could occur.
Okay, so that's coming home to me. So if you bought a piece of equipment from somebody and it already had something bad in it, that's supply chain subversion.
That is supply chain subversion. If you purchase a piece of software and the company from which you purchased that software and downloaded it, embedded malware in that software, that's also supply chain subversion. And it doesn't need to be necessarily the company that inserted it directly. It could be someone that hacked into the company and inserted it on their behalf. And that
okay, can I just, you're scaring me. I just want to report that you're making me think that there's nothing safe in the world, and maybe that is in fact the case. But now, could you tell us about phishing? We've all heard phishing a little bit, and hopefully most of us are getting training to try to avoid it. But I have to admit, those of us who aren't in your field are probably a little more lax about that. So what is phishing and how does it relate to elections?
Okay, well, phishing actually comes back to your comment earlier about thinking, oh, I don't need second factors of authentication or things like that when you're working at home. So one of the ways adversaries get into our systems is by stealing our passwords. And a common way to do that is by sending us messages that look legitimate or that otherwise cause us to click on a link, log into what we think is a legitimate website, but then we just gave the criminal our password. So if we're an election official that was, quote, phished, then the criminal might get access to restricted systems. More often, it's the end users who are phished, which could enable changing of addresses or other things to mess up that individual's voter registration, for example. Let's say you pretended to be the election site and you stole the user's password and you changed where their ballots get sent, for example. Or if it's a campaign official, if their passwords are phished, then maybe the criminal gets access to internal documents, which could be leaked on WikiLeaks or elsewhere, as sort of we saw happen in 2016 with the DNC emails. Now, the main takeaway with respect to phishing is first really awareness. And second, to employ things like, and here's what you were talking about, second factors of authentication, such as a text message code that comes to your phone, or stronger methods. So in addition to the password, you need to prove you are actually in possession of some physical device, and the two factors together provide for a stronger form of authentication.
Okay, we're moving that direction, and I know we got to do it, but I still haven't signed up for it. And now let's take on denial of service. I think I've heard about this in one of the states in a minor election. What is a denial of service and how does it relate to elections?
Well, finally, a denial of service attack simply tries to shut down systems by overwhelming them with fake queries, for example, or disabling communications. And they are very difficult to deal with from a computer security perspective, other than through redundancy, what we call over provisioning of resources so that you actually end up overwhelmed. Now, the biggest problems and the things that you've sort of seen with respect to maybe elections is things like a denial of service attack on voter registration systems. Now, a denial of service attack is sometimes indistinguishable from just a simple failure. Okay, so you can try to cause these failures by overwhelming the systems, but we actually saw two instances of general failures, not cyber attacks, but causing this kind of denial of service. In Florida, the day that the voter registration deadline, their system simply became overwhelmed with the number of people trying to register. The effect of that's really no different than if an adversary were trying to cause or overwhelm that. And in Virginia, you saw, I guess, a Verizon work crew accidentally severed a communications line into the system where voter registrations were occurring. Evidently, also on the last day to register to vote. So that's really why denial of service attacks are so difficult to resolve.
Wendy, if
totally
I can
get
add a PS to what Cliff just said, we did an off-the-record, confidential election cybersecurity program for the Commonwealth of Virginia in the state capital in Richmond. And one of the people the state invited to join was from the Virginia Department of Transportation. Transportation, why are they here? Because you don't want road construction crews out on election day anywhere near a polling place.
Oh my goodness, I thought you were going to say it's because the Department of Motor Vehicles sends records over to voter registration. But no, it's a very physical, you got to think all the ways. You can't just think cyber, you have to think physical as well.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, actually here in Los Angeles County, on the day of the primary elections last year, you actually had power failures in some neighborhoods with voting locations that prevented those polling locations from actually being used.
Some of what we're talking about makes me realize that cybersecurity is sort of one subset of an umbrella group of things that could go wrong in an election. Cybersecurity attacks is only one of many things. You could have a power outage, you could have a line cut, you could have a tornado, and maybe the protection is similar. Can you draw anything together there for us?
Well, absolutely. I often speak about it in this way. So
Okay.
you've got similarities between cybersecurity and sort of more general failures that can occur, but there is a big difference. And the big difference is that when you look at things like hurricanes, tornadoes, you look at things like just failures of electrical equipment, there is a statistical distribution of those that allows you to apply statistics to understand how you put redundant resources in place to deal with some number of failures. In the case of cybersecurity, what you have is an intelligent adversary that knows specifically where your weak points are. So you can't use the statistical distributions to make sure that you have at least two instances of something, because the adversary will target both of them.
Okay, I like what you're saying there. It does mean you need to have your eye on the cyber piece, but yet anything you do to kind of protect on the cyber front sounds like it might also protect on the other side. And all the things you could do on cyber security protection won't protect you against those things that are outside that envelope.
I think that's accurate to say. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, Adam, you are in fact a journalist by trade. You were telling us the other day a little bit about election results and cybersecurity. Could you bring that link together for us, please?
Sure. Well, our friends at the Homeland Security have a wonderful expression. They say, what is the return on investment for a bad actor? And one of the great strengths of American elections is that we are decentralized. We have on the order of 10,000 different elections around the country for President of the United States. Then we add all the numbers together and we come up with the Electoral College on a winner. Well, so it's very, very difficult if you are sitting in a foreign country, or if you're a bad actor in the United States, if you're trying to tamper with the election at the point at which people actually are casting votes, because there are just too many targets. So they start to look for places where the election results are centralized. And the big central point on election night, this has nothing to do with the states tabulating results or the secretaries of states certifying the results, but the big central point of tabulation on election night is the Associated Press. The AP provides the vote totals to all of the news agencies, all the television, all the cable, all the radio, and the internet. And so adversaries now realize that the AP is the place to attack on election night, whether it's to take the system down. And if the AP goes down on election night, we simply don't have election returns that night until the states report the results, which can be 2, 3, 4, 5 in 2020, 7 days later. And so again, if the adversaries are working to reduce faith in democracy itself, that's a pretty dramatic reduction of faith in democracy itself if you're turning on your computer or your TV set on election night and you can't find out who's won.
Excellent point. So you could attack voter registration, which we did see some of in 2016 without actually changing any records. And that's bad, but it doesn't change the vote. You could attack the vote itself. That's really catastrophic, but as Cliff has explained, that's not really happening. Or you could attack as the results are heading to the AP, or the way I was thinking of it, as to the press more generally, or wherever it's going. And that will sow confusion and doubt, which is not something that's going to work on elections.
And we know the president of the Associated Press is on our advisory board, and
nice.
And he said that in 2012, a few attacks. 2016, serious attacks. In 2020, major attacks, predominantly from Russia on the AP system.
Wow. Okay, we have Larry in the chat box who's saying using social media for misinformation is probably a good ROI for the attacker. We haven't really gotten to that yet, but maybe this is a good opportunity to mention that.
Absolutely, and we've seen again over the course of the 2020 election year, Russia in particular using new techniques, and they would roll out in different ways. For example, there was something called franchising. I think that's the word that Homeland Security used, where Russia and some other countries actually paid American journalists who were unaware of who was paying them to file phony reports or file reports which were misleading. Russia and China, I believe, actually had websites running on computers in the United States masquerading as journalistic websites, but actually they were propaganda and trying to spread confusion. And in 2020, when everybody on this call knows that we were changing the dates, places, and methods of how you vote, it was really critical that correct information reached the voters. And so some bad actors were doing their best to sow confusion. Very little expense to them, but again, trying to dent confidence in democracy and trying to create confusion. Sometimes they were accidental. I'm sure you remember there were some billboards put up by an election information organization, and they had made a mistake. They actually made a mistake on the election day. And there it was on billboards, and they corrected them. But under the best of circumstances, as we all know, elections are very, very complicated things to hold, and any tampering with the reliable chain of information can really cause confusion.
I've heard it said, and this is probably an urban legend, that candidates can say Democrats vote on Tuesday and Republicans vote on Wednesday. I don't know if that's ever happened or vice versa, whichever way you want to tell that story. And so that's misinformation that predates the internet. But misinformation has to be dealt with somehow, no matter where it's coming from. And I don't think we have policy solutions yet on how to deal with misinformation. Any thoughts about options at the state level for correcting that?
What secretaries of state said, and we had in close to half the states where we did workshops last year, we had the Secretary of State opening the program, and they always emphasize that for reliable information, go to the state government, to the Secretary of State or whoever the responsible election official is, sometimes the lieutenant governor, sometimes attorney general, but that is your rock solid source of good information.
Got it. And I am going to bring this around soon to legislative options. So just be thinking about that, Cliff and Adam. What are things on any of the things we've discussed that can be addressed with policy as opposed to with boots on the ground, perhaps? But before we get there, Cliff, we've mentioned physical security briefly, but I'm thinking about it in the election envelope, about locks and bipartisan teams, that kind of stuff. Where does cybersecurity fit in with physical security? How do you see those as being hand in glove, or do you see them as hand in glove?
Well, I mean, we've seen instances sort of external from the election, although in sort of the aftermath of it, with the takeover of our nation's capital, for example, on January 6th. And there are lots of computer devices that fell into the possession of those storming the Capitol, including a laptop in conference rooms, including Nancy Pelosi's desktop systems, for example. And this could potentially happen in state capitals too. Now, how physical security comes into play here is that you need to understand that much of security of computing devices is based on an assumption that the adversary is sort of on the outside, doesn't have necessarily physical access to that particular device. And it's very hard to protect the data on a device that is in the hands of the adversary, where in fact the adversary might actually be, in some cases, a legitimate user of that. Now, when the adversary isn't a legitimate user, we use things like whole disk encryption. So someone gets hold of your laptop as you're going through airport security. You don't want them just sucking all the data right off of it. But I think that this physical security of devices plays a role in elections in the sense that we're not going to anytime soon see us actually conducting our elections online where you vote from your cell phone or you vote from your laptop computer. Why not? Because it's hard enough to protect all the devices that are in the possession of the election officials. it's impossible to protect all the devices that are in the hands of the individual voters, because you don't necessarily trust all those voters. I mean, if you take, not to say we shouldn't trust our populace, but understand that every one of the adversaries that is trying to manipulate votes is themselves a potential voter. And as a result, you've got to be concerned about securing their devices. You've got to be concerned about securing the devices of all the legitimate voters in light of maybe all these apps that you install on your cell phone. I mean, I like to ask, how many apps do you have installed on your cell phone? You know, you get up to about 40 apps and people are still raising their hands. Every one of these apps is a potential vulnerability. It's a potential one of those viruses or malware we were speaking about. And the inability to protect that device itself physically, when it is out of the possession of those managing the elections, makes it really an almost impossible task.
So Cliff, you begged for this question. How many apps do you have on your phone?
I have about 7 apps, and many of them I leave in a disabled state so they don't run in the background.
Oh, very nice. Okay, so can you tell us how we do that? Somehow we get into settings and find apps?
Yeah, well, there are so many different settings on so many different kinds of cell phones.
Okay, all right, we won't do
decide
it
to
now,
do
but
that.
that's good. Okay, so when I asked you that question about physical security, I have to tell you what I thought you were going to say is that locks matter, lights matter, cameras matter, those seal tapes on voting equipment, and bipartisan teams. So you didn't say that, you don't have to say that, but that's when I was thinking about physical security, I was literally thinking that kind of stuff for the ballots and for the voting equipment.
Well, the seal tapes that you said on the equipment is part of one of the things that creates sort of the physical security. But the seal tapes is something you call tamper evidence rather than tamper proof. In other words, that tape doesn't prevent someone from getting in and changing things. What it does is it means that when it is back in your possession, you can determine that someone's been inside.
Got it. Got it.
So all of these are steps that are important in improving the physical security. But the big takeaway here is that physical security is important because of all the things that can occur when you don't have it.
All right, I love it. So we want physical security and more. Adam, I'm coming back to you. Let's get to that policy part. The folks who are here primarily work for legislators or are legislators. And so what is it that they can do that would be helpful to their state's cybersecurity?
Well, what we saw last year when we went to all 50 states, again, most of them virtually because of the pandemic, but we saw that each state has interesting and strong resources and assets, including and starting perhaps with state governments. Each of the state governments has cybersecurity assets, which in each of the workshops, we would say, here are the places you can go in your state. Here are the agencies in your state. And the states are all different, but the states, and that's good. The states are the laboratories of democracy, and we saw some really outstanding examples of innovations. In each of the 50 states, the National Guard is a new player since 5 years ago. They've really stood up as a major force in cybersecurity, and probably already very closely working very closely with election officials. Something else we found in across the country is that universities have also stepped up. There are centers of excellence, cybersecurity centers of excellence throughout the country, sometimes in places where you wouldn't expect. So that's a huge asset. In terms of state legislatures, I think that in 2020, even as we were in perhaps what we hope will be the extreme case of demands on election systems, again, changing the dates, places, and methods of voting. But even in the midst of that, state legislatures were paying close attention to election cybersecurity. What we need to do now is not to relax our vigilance, because our adversaries are, they're inventive, they have R&D, they're using different techniques, and so stay up to date on updates that are coming from Homeland Security and CISA. There are assets that are, resources that are available from the federal government and from industry. And Wendy, if I may, if I can just put up a slide, if I can just share my screen. This is the website of the USC Election Cybersecurity Initiative. And if you go to this website, www.electionsecurity.usc.edu, you'll see a tab for resources. There's another tab for a weekly blog that we have with updates on resources. Videos are there. And of course, the schedule of our 2021 schedule of all of the workshops we'll be doing. And videos from almost all of our workshops last year. So you can go to Nebraska or Louisiana or Montana and see what your state officials said in 2020 about election security. So that's something that I put up because there are many resources that are available to states and to state legislatures and we're not talking about things for which you need forgive me, Cliff, a computer science degree, but they're for general audiences. And so they are written for state legislatures to become more informed on these issues.
And when you put that slide up, it reminded me of your slogan. Would you tell us a little bit about the slogan, please?
In 2019, when we were planning our 2020 50 state campaign, we met with people, state election and campaign officials, national officials here in Washington, and we met with people who've run campaigns, again, for governor, for the Senate, for the House, and we met with people who run presidential campaigns. And two of them who are actually at USC, one of them is Bob Shrum, who ran John Kerry's 2004 campaign and many other Democratic campaigns. And the other is Mike Murphy, who ran the Jeb Bush campaign in 2016. And I said, we're like you guys. We're going to run a 50-state campaign, but without a candidate. And Bob Shrum leaned forward and he said, Adam, you're wrong. Your candidate is democracy. I said, whoa, I'm going to take that. That's going to be our slogan. And so, in fact, just a few days ago, I reminded him that he gave us our slogan for 2020 and beyond. And that really tells a story. We're not favoring one party or another. We are favoring democracy.
I love it. I just think that needs to be brought out every time we talk. We should revisit that question. Cliff, on your side, I wonder if you are able to use your crystal ball and tell us about threats that might be coming. I mean, sort of more of the same, or maybe it's too hard to know what's the next step. But we've already identified that registration was where the interest was in 2016, and misinformation was what we saw most of in 2020. Do you have any thoughts about where we're headed?
Well, I think the adversaries are going to continue to try to attack the infrastructure itself and actually the counting of votes. And you're going to see what they learned in things like SolarWinds being applied in a much more manner to try to get them deeper into these particular systems. In fact, one of the things you need to understand about nation-state attacks, basically these what we call advanced persistent threats, is that they are multi-step processes. An organization will get into one company or one set of systems and use that as a stepping stone to get deeper in. And in fact, you look at things like the SolarWinds breach, and in fact, it was very much staged, trying to get deeper and deeper into the supply chains. And those kinds of threats are going to continue to play out. We need to be extremely vigilant about them. And kinds of things that we need to focus on in terms of our protection of these systems is really the issue of integrity of our systems, the assurance that we have on the particular components that we run. how can we best assess that the software that we install next year is going to be free from these kinds of vulnerabilities? And yeah, there are a lot of people working on this. We've been fairly successful in sort of the election space so far, but we shouldn't get our confidence too high that we're going to be immune from these kinds of more advanced attacks.
I think you're saying we can't rest on our laurels.
I think certainly I am. And sometimes I've described sort of the cybersecurity community as really the only job you can have where the worse job you do, the more in demand you will be.
You're right. And that gets to the next question that could be for either one of you. And that's about resources. When people are really scared, when something bad happens, they put their focus on it and they put their money towards it. And they devote personnel towards it. So with getting through the 2020 election, as we saw, no votes were tampered with as far as anybody knows, including Department of Homeland Security. What do we do in terms of resources, both money and people in the next 4 years? And particularly, where will that money come from?
Okay, so I think a couple of things. First of all, many of the problems that we're trying to address with cybersecurity in the area of elections are simply an application of a broader problem. So there should be more fundamental research on this issue of assurance of our computer systems in general that will share dividends across both the election community and sort of government in general, corporations in general. And that means that the cost of some of that work can be spread. It doesn't need to all come out of the election budget. But we really need to have this kind of focus in terms of our computing. Now, we also need to, I think, have a better understanding of what actually constitutes attempts to manipulate elections in different ways. I mean, there are many kinds of voter fraud that occur and things like that. And understand which of these are more organized, are going to have greater impact versus which are, you know, even less than grassroots, sort of the daughter of someone that passed away that turns in the ballot. You're not gonna expend a lot of money dealing with that because, first of all, statistically, the effect balances out. It happened on both sides. But we do need to put measures in place to understand with maybe the increasing reliance in some states on voting from home, for example, or absentee or vote at home ballots. Are there things that can be done to improve the almost physical security aspect of that in terms of distribution of ballots, in terms of balancing the, let's say, signature verification, where you need to balance, you know, the problem of maybe too many ballots being rejected because of a minor change in the signature versus wholesale attempts to manipulate things that might occur in that way. I think you need to sort of step up a level and try to understand what the real problems are before you start to put in the solutions that you think are going to solve all of them.
Okay, that was not the answer I expected. Adam. Yeah.
Wendy, in terms of resources, I think that we can expect more resources from to be available from the federal government this year because I think everybody realizes it's a problem. And I mean, some resources were available last year, but we expect to have some more. And that's something which is going to be extremely important.
I completely agree that more funding from the federal government would be welcomed in the states. And I know that many of the elections are run by local counties, and some have more resources than others. And some states have more resources on their own than others. And so I think I've heard it said in the past that the weak link could easily be the small, poor county. So it's to everybody's advantage at the local level, at the state level, and then at the federal level to be looking at what's the appropriate share. I want to say, I'm going to wrap us up fairly soon here, but I wanted to kind of give you a chance, Adam, to talk about what you experienced in terms of the professionalism or the commitment of election officials around the nation. The question has come up this year, were they partisan in one way or another? And I think you have a very excellent vantage point to make some statements about election officials.
We saw in all 50 states a level of commitment and professionalism which was remarkable under the most difficult circumstances which we will probably face in our lifetimes.
Let's hope.
Everybody took security very seriously. Everybody took elections very seriously. And it was very impressive to go across the country and see in state after state how well things worked. And there's some people who haven't received the credit they should. I'll just mention one state, Nebraska. Nebraska pivoted from 25% mail-in voting to 75% mail-in voting. And they did it in a matter of days. People said that was impossible. They said, oh, it'll take you months, maybe years to do that. No, somehow in Nebraska, they pulled that off in a matter of a very short time. That was stunning. That was stunning. And other states actually started to study, how did Nebraska do that? And so there are stories like that across the country, which a few of which actually wound up in the national press. But it was quite an education for us and reassuring for us.
That's fabulous. My experience has primarily been very excellent with local election officials and certainly with the state level people. So it feels to me as though that's a subject within the general public administration universe where people who are willing to do everything from sweep the floors and turn out the lights to become sort of the cybersecurity expert for their county or wherever it might be. It's a lot of hats that those folks wear. Okay, here's my wrap-up question. My wrap-up question is for both of you. And Cliff, I'm going to go to you first. We've talked about nothing but scary things here. We've talked about nothing but bad news. Bring us something positive, please.
Well, I think in some sense, we started off with some good news, at least around the 2020 election. And that is that the awareness and the commitment, as Adam was just speaking about, is somewhat encouraging. So, I think that is a really good news. In fact, on some of our calls, we'd have the Secretary of State explaining some of the things that they were doing. And I'd think to myself, this is worthy of a lecture I might give my students in cybersecurity. It showed some level of real understanding of what's on. And I think that is encouraging. It's really all about awareness, whether it is awareness from the low-level individual, awareness of phishing, two-factor authentication, or other things, to awareness at the higher level about the importance of isolation and things that you did see start to be applied in these areas. And I think that's probably the biggest encouragement that we've got.
Well, a big success story in 2020 was that we had a classic good election. We did not see any successful tampering. Certainly, as Attorney General Barr said, nothing that would change the election in terms of cybersecurity tampering. But the election official in Kentucky had a wonderful way of talking about it. He said, nobody got in. But we could see the bad actors trying the doorknob to see if they could get in, and they couldn't get in. So that's the good news.
Well, the bad news on that is you just don't know if they got it. But...
Okay, I'm going to pretend you didn't say that. I want to leave us on a good note. And my good news here is that USC has made the kind of commitment that you all have made to being in this space and making your work available around the nation. So I want to thank you both for doing it. Mention again that you have an event on March 25th coming up, and that's in the chat box if anybody wants to do it. And I'm going to think of you all as partners to NCSL and encourage anyone who's on the line to think of you as possible partners in their state or their community. This will be recorded, and we will link it on NCSL's Elections Cybersecurity webpage. And with that, I'm going to just say thanks very much. Stay in touch and stay engaged with the work you're doing, and pretend that everybody in the outside is applauding for you all now. Thank you.
Thank you.